But in terms of getting out of exposure, I think, it's pretty similar globally, right? This issue of being able to, first of all, recognize that there's a problem, but also easily get out of exposure and then find an appropriate place to move to, right? I think is the big problem.
Yeah.
The things that I see consistently that I think are fairly common, at least in Australia, and I think it would be similar in similar countries. Houses are going up very quickly because they're often investment properties, and so they're really just thrown up as quickly as possible. And obviously, there are then problems because of the quality of the build is not great. So that's where you come into this. We think about old homes being mostly problematic, but actually new homes are also, I feel like in the middle there somewhere is the best. We're having problems with new homes because of that quality here as well. The fact that houses don't breathe is a big issue, trying to keep the heat in, trying to keep the cool in. These are all, I think, fairly global problems. In Australia in particular, the combination of humidity, especially along the coast, and rain is a big one. Just causes a lot of kind of increased humidity and, condensation issues, I guess, without even having water ingress. It's just this condensation. And then the cross contamination, I think, is often, not spoken about as well. You don't know what the people before you in the home, what their furniture was like, where their previous home was. So you kind of come up, against all of these problems. And in terms of, in inspecting and sampling homes, like finding somewhere, I think you definitely need to do both. I think a big problem is people don't sample. They just, go and have a look at the house and think, oh, it looks good. It definitely can look good and not be good. I've experienced that myself in our current home. Looked perfect. We even did some sampling and it didn't look too bad. And I was sick as soon as I came
Oh,
into the house, and it took to really like demolish the whole bathroom and the front of the house to find the problem. So it's a really common issue, I think, and people just don't. And also, I think it's probably similar everywhere else too in terms of the sampling. It's not perfect, right? The testing isn't perfect. Everybody thinks slightly differently of which sampling they should do and what's the gold standard. I tend to go with let's do a bit of everything just to cover our bases. Definitely kind of usually start with an ERMI test to judge, what's going on in the home before you even need to bring in a professional. And then if the ERMI shows problems, then you can kind of bring in an IEP or a building biologist or someone that's kind of very familiar with this problem. So, I think there's not a huge difference in Australia as to getting out of exposure. I think the one thing compared especially to the US and maybe even Canada that we have that's a benefit, an advantage, is that we don't typically have basements, and so we typically build on concrete slabs, and that's an advantage, right? Because we're not obviously as soon as you get down into the dirt, you have potential problems. So that's one advantage, but the rest I think is pretty similar in terms of the getting out of exposure.
got it. Well, that's good. So you do
Yeah.
have access to ERMI testing there with and
Yes.
is that through I mean the company we're familiar with here in the States is Envirobiomics. Do you have a lab that's there or how do you any specific one to look out for if somebody's in your area, your neck of the
Yeah,
woods?
so as far as I'm aware, there's only one. I did hear that there was a second lab recently, but I'm not familiar with what they're doing and where it's going and whatnot, so I can't comment. But the one that I'm aware of that's been going for decades is called NSJ Enviroscience, I think and that's run by David Lark, who
Okay.
has done a lot of research with Dr. Shoemaker.
Yeah.
And so he's been doing it for decades and decades. And so that's typically where we send, and he services the whole of Australia. So basically anybody can send in a dust sample. And unfortunately, it's got to go to the US, which is, is frustrating from a time perspective. And that's, I think, one of the big issues with renting is that you just don't have that kind of time, right?
No.
It's especially along the coast, in the populous kind of cities. You just don't have that kind of time to get testing back before, someone else just takes the rental, right? So it's okay if you're buying, but it's not okay if you're renting. And that's one of the big problems, I think, where people just kind of go to a rental that looks good, but isn't actually okay. So, yeah.
That's unfortunate.